Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. G'day legends. If you are a part of any online mixing community, any of those online audio groups, you would have come across the conversation that goes a little bit something like, how do I get my mixes to sound better? How can I make my mixes sound more professional? And then you would have seen the kind of answers that go something like this. Make sure you have some decent monitoring, make sure you treat your space, and make sure you use reference tracks. And now, I'm not here to say reference tracks are bad at all. That's not the point of this video. I do want to share some of my thoughts and opinions on reference tracks, how and when to use them, and some traps to watch out for. Reference tracks are great when you are starting out, learning how to mix and training your ears. So by listening to some of your favorite mixes, listening to the levels, listening to the EQ, how it's all shaped and put together is a great way of doing some ear training and then trying to apply that to your mixes as well. Trying to achieve sounds like those references is a great way of improving your skills. I highly recommend if you're starting out mixing, grab some reference tracks, pick some of your songs that you like, the kind of sounds that you want to try and achieve. Listen to how all the instruments glue together, where the levels are, where the vocals sit, how much reverb's on the vocals, stuff like that. Just pay attention to the track and listen to those things so that you can try and implement them in your mixes. Now, this is where things can get a little tricky with reference tracks. Say if you're working on a song of your own, you might have recorded a song, or maybe someone has sent you a track to mix and they have given you a reference track. Maybe you have picked a reference track for a song that you're working on and something that you want to try and make it sound like. And maybe that reference track sounds nothing like the track that you're working on. And this is where things can get a little bit tricky, because just picking a reference track and saying, I want to make my mix sound like that, can actually be really problematic if all of the elements in the mix sound nothing like that track. Because then what you're going to feel like you have to do is change your track dramatically to try and make it sound like this reference that you've picked. So you might listen to your reference and say, okay, my kick doesn't sound anything like that. You might EQ it a little bit and be like, can't get it to sound like that. Let's go find a sample. You might look for a sample and replace the kick. You might do the same with the snare. And then you might be working on some guitars and you'd be wondering, why can't I get my guitars to sound like the guitars in this reference that I've been given? Maybe these guitars were recorded with a combo. Maybe they're played on a Strat. But then maybe what you're hearing on the reference track is a Gibson played through a stack. And so they're completely different sounds and tones. But just because you're so focused on the reference, you might be trying to force this guitar to sound like something it should never sound like. And that's really where reference tracks can become reference traps. Clever little thing that I just came up with then. But it really is a trap that you can fall into. It's just this rabbit hole of trying to force a circle into a square. And I've fallen into this trap many times. I remember working on one of my own songs. I picked a song to reference and I just tried so hard to make it sound like this other song. And it just sounded really bad in the end. It wasn't a very good mix with the final product. And after a while, I kind of just gave up and was like, that's it. But then later on, I came back and I mixed it and I didn't reference anything. I just went with my intuition, mixed it how I thought it should sound, and it was way better. So sometimes using a reference is actually way more problematic if it doesn't suit the track itself. What I've kind of come to terms with reference tracks is, if you use a reference while mixing, it's just a ballpark. You don't really want to be like, I'm going to make this sound exactly like that. But you can use it as a ballpark sound. You might be like, okay, I listen to the overall brightness of that reference track, and that's how bright I want to make my mix sound. You know, that mix has a lot of bass in it, so let's make sure this track has a lot of bass in it. Don't try and make the sounds exactly the same. Just listen to the overall sonic signature of the reference and see if you can get your mix to come close to that, but don't try and force it to sound exactly the same. And it really shouldn't sound exactly the same anyway. You go and listen to like 10 different tracks on Spotify, they're all gonna sound pretty different. And that's a good thing, because you want your music to stand out. You don't want it to sound exactly like someone else. So if you're doing this as a profession like myself, you have people sending you tracks to mix, this is sometimes a conversation you have to have with them. You ask them about reference, but then you also have to remind them, it may not sound exactly like the reference, but it's just gonna give me an idea of where to try and take this track. And sometimes you'll get clients and they say, hey, I like the drums in this mix, I like the guitars in this mix, I like the vocals from this mix, and they give you kind of like 5 or 6 references. And to me, that's a bit of a red flag for problems to come up, because while all those elements might sound cool in their own state, trying to put all of that together may not even work. So I think it's always best to try and keep referencing to like 1 or 2 tracks and make sure that they're kind of similar. You really don't want to give your mix engineer 2 different references and confuse the hell out of them about which direction to try and take your mix in. And if you are going to seriously chase a sound, like you've picked a reference and you want your song to sound exactly like that, you really need to take that reference from the ground up. So when you're tracking drums, make sure you pick drums and tune them in a way that sounds the same as your references. Pick drum samples that match those songs. Listen to the guitar tones and try and get a similar thing going. Listen to the layering as you're arranging your song. Try and match that stuff and get a similar thing happening. That is the only way that you'll ever really get a track to sound exactly like a reference, is if you pretty much copy it from the get-go. And while I think it's great to take inspiration from references, you really don't want to copy a track exactly to the T, because there's nothing too original about that. So that's just my thoughts and opinions on referencing. Take it or leave it. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. But I do encourage you to try not to fall into the trap of trying to force a song into something that it's not. And just another little thought, that when we are referencing tracks, some of these mixes, the mix engineer probably didn't reference anything themselves. They just put their own original stamp on their mix. And that's something you should be wanting to do too, putting your own stamp on your mixes, because in the end, it's your art as well, and you don't want to always be copying other people. You want to have your own style too. So everything in moderation. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, check out the description link below, check out the drum samples and mix courses on my website if you want to support this channel. Stick around for this next video. I'm going to show you 12 extremely useful recording hacks.